Hello everyone and welcome to Political Economy. Today's lesson is going to introduce you to some of the most fundamental concepts of political economy, not the concepts themselves, but basically what we're going to cover in this course. So we're going to look at the different discipline of political economy and the different theoretical approaches that it follows. And broadly speaking, we're going to learn that these days political economy is mostly a critique of what we understand to be economics, and especially the methods and focuses of economics. This is not always the case. Political economy has quite a long history, as we'll discover. And for most of human history, people have naturally associated the economic world with the political world. That's something that changed really drastically in the 20th century with the evolution and establishment of the discipline of economics, which, as we'll see today, tried to establish the idea of the economy as a physical entity, which can be studied like a physical science. So by contrast, here's a good, basic but good definition of political economy. Political economy is more concerned with the relationships of the economic system and its institutions to the rest of society and its social development. And this is a really important point because it reminds us the only reason the economy exists is to serve human needs. Now, next it says it's sensitive to the influence of non-economic factors such as political and social institutions, morality and ideology in determining economic events. Now, what this means is that behind every single economic decision that a person makes, there are factors such as politics or the social institutions, culture, morality, ideology, beliefs. All of these shape the way we make decisions. All of these have an important impact on the way the economy works. And that's what makes political economy quite different from the discipline of economics. So here are some of the theoretical perspectives we're going to be looking at this semester. This is not an exhaustive list, but these are the main theorists that we're going to cover. We're going to start with this introduction, which will give you an idea of political economy as a challenge to economics. We're going to run through Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and Thomas Malthus. These three theorists grouped together are what's known as classical political economy. They're not the only classical political economists, but they're the main ones. And I'm going to give you, some of their main ideas. It's obviously impossible to study in depth all of these important thinkers in the short time that we have, but by the end of the course, you'll have an idea about what they were talking about and what their perspective means. Then we're going to look at some theorists who are much more critical of capitalism. So Karl Marx, Torsten Veblen, John Maynard Keynes, John Kenneth Galbraith, Paul Barron and Paul Sweezy, and finally Karl Polanyi. They're very different people with very different beliefs about the way the world works and about the way the economy works, about whether capitalism is going to be successful in the long run or whether it's a total failure, or whether it's a total failure, but it's also going to be successful. All of these beliefs can coexist. So what unites them, though, is that they think in a way capitalism is not going to work by itself. And there's various reasons for this, which we'll get into later. So we'll conclude the course having seen that there's lots of different perspectives that you can take wisdom from and learn from in terms of understanding the economy as more than just a physical thing, as something that's incredibly complicated and incredibly interesting to study too, I hope you think. So the starting point of political economy, I mean, this is not the exact starting point. I guess there is no exact starting point, but for the purpose of the course, we can consider The Wealth of Nations, which is written by Adam Smith, as the effective starting point of political economy. The Wealth of Nations was written in 1776. And while there was some analysis that we can describe as political economy before Smith's book, the important difference is that most of this analysis, all of this analysis, didn't call itself political economy and didn't attempt to address such a comprehensive theory as what Smith's book did. For example, there's a French school called the Physiocrats. Now, their argument was that all value comes from land. And we'll see later that one of the fundamental parts of political economy is that it always argues that value comes from somewhere. Okay, so the Physiocrats said, well, we know where value comes from. All value comes from the land. And Smith was one of the first people to criticize this perspective. Smith advocated for a labor theory of value, which is slightly different. Basically that all value comes from labor. And him and his cohort are part of what's called classical political economy. So Smith's Wealth of Nations was one of the first fully integrated perspectives which combined both economic theory and history all together. And it's really important to think about the context in which Smith was writing, which is Britain in the late 18th century. So what was going on at the time? Well, Britain was expanding its empire. It was becoming a much more powerful force on the world scene. And Smith argued really strongly for a theory based on a division of labor, free markets, and free trade. So immediately the question you need to be asking is, well, politically speaking, why was Smith arguing for a theory of free markets and free trade? You know, how does that help Britain at the time? So have that question in the back of your mind. So Smith's most famous concept you've probably heard before is the invisible hand. And this is an argument that markets are self-regulating. In other words, they don't need government to fix them. However, his theory is much more detailed than this. And in this week's lecture on Smith, we're going to see and go into some of the other perspectives of Smith that are less widely known than the invisible hand. So political economy shares the same roots as economics. In fact, economics wouldn't exist without these theories of political economy that it's built upon. But these days, political economy is also a critique of economics as well. So one thing that we know is that as the natural sciences evolved and became more advanced, physics, chemistry, and biology, many social scientists attempted and failed to try and move in the same direction. And economics represents the attempt to take a social science like political economy and evolve it into something comparable to the natural sciences, economics. So economics pretends to be a science by emphasizing mathematics and statistics. When we think of economics, the first thing that comes to mind is probably some obscure supply-demand curve or some other behavioral curve being represented, you know, or some strange formula or something like that. We think of maths, we think of statistics, we think of quantitative stuff. Now, there's a lot of problems with this approach, but some examples of the problems of economics include that anything an economist can't easily measure or analyze quantitatively isn't considered important, right? A really good example of this is what we're dealing with right now, which is, you know, the externalities of climate change. Because when we burn the air or we create pollution or something like that, there's no market cost associated with that. Then we don't care about it so much until very recently. So the second thing is that a lot of the assumptions about human behavior and social reality that economics uses rest on faith. In other words, we just assume them to be true. We don't test them. And even when people do test these propositions and say, well, we don't think it's quite true, what we will see is that economists steadfastly cling to the belief that these things are true. Right? So what this leads to is a number of people compare economics to a religion rather than a science. Yeah? So even when notions like self-regulating markets or economic man have been proven false, what we can see is that economists still believe in them. And that is a challenging thing for economics in its claim to be a science. So we can therefore speak of a division between mainstream economics, so the economics profession as a whole, and we'll sometimes see this referred to as neoclassical economics, and political economy. Now, mainstream economics has either ignored or attempted to discredit alternative ways of thinking about the economy. If you take economics as a major in most universities in the world, you're not going to hear about most of the theories we're going to study in this class, even though these are all economic theories. So as a short summary of the political economy critique, we can see that political economy argues mainstream economic models are too narrowly conceived. In other words, they're not detailed enough to explain the world. You know, the world is more complex than what can possibly be modeled. Next, mainstream economic models are unnecessarily complicated, using fancy and unnecessary quantitative analysis and mathematical terms to express ideas. You know, so I'm not going to argue that what we're going to study this semester is going to be simple, but it's not going to be terribly mathematical. And what's that it's intended to show you is that you don't need high-level mathematics or statistics to understand the economy and its integration with society. Finally, mainstream economics depends on restrictive and questionable assumptions about individual behavior. and suggests also that our behavior has never changed. Now, anybody with even the faintest understanding of history knows that human cultures have evolved and changed, sometimes dramatically over time, and that therefore our behavior has evolved and changed dramatically as well. So assumptions like the idea of rational economic man, which is one of the most foundational assumptions of mainstream economics, are very difficult to defend. I mean, even if we use our day-to-day experience, we know we don't always make rational economic decisions. I'm sure at some point, some of you have wasted money on something. You failed to profit maximize. You failed to make the most out of your money. You probably get that nag from your parents all the time that you waste money or resources or that sort of thing. You're not investing them for maximum return. Okay, so we know very well that waste takes place all over the world. And therefore, how can we argue a theory based on the idea that everybody rationally allocates their resources at all times? And if everybody doesn't rationally allocate resources at all times, why are we basing so much of our understanding on the modern economy upon this assumption? So why is it important to, I guess, critique economics? One of the main reasons this critique is important is because economists and people who think in this way have a very disproportionate academic and policy influence. One of the most interesting things about economics is that they've been wrong about almost every major event that's occurred in capitalism. Not a single economist predicted the global financial crisis of 2008. The same can be said for the major depressions and recessions that existed all throughout the 20th century, right? They've been proven wrong in every case, and yet when government wants advice on what to do about the economy, economists are some of the first people they contact. We trust economists to provide good advice. So economics, for better or worse, has legitimacy because people believe in it, kind of in the same way that religion has legitimacy because people believe in it. So our job this semester is to test this legitimacy. Is it legitimate? Is it real? Is it valid that we give so much of our trust and faith to these economists when they seem not to have an explanation for very many things? After we look at the theories this semester of some alternative perspectives, you can decide for yourself how much you trust economists. So what's wrong with economics? I thought it was a good major. I'm going to run down the economics major now and suggest that it has some serious limitations. So economics claims to be a science, but it fails to explain and predict events in the real world. And one of the hallmarks of sciences is its ability to explain and predict things. So economics can't explain and predict things in the real world. That's why I think we shouldn't treat it as a science. That's why I think we should treat it as a kind of deformed social science. One of the reasons for this is the idea of economic man. So you'll sometimes see economic man written as Homo economicus, so in the Latin. And this is the idea that human beings have a economic motive where we're constantly thinking about how to maximize our profit, and we're constantly motivated by and only motivated by profit and loss. There are other assumptions that human beings are have an unlimited desire for goods, that we have a willingness to act rationally and maximize profits 100% of the time. So economic models are also usually ahistorical. So they don't include a history component. There is an argument that there are universal laws of economics, for example, that stand outside of history and society. Now, most economists are ignorant of the history of economic ideas. Why? Because the history of economic ideas is not taught in most economics majors. So even if you study this stuff, nobody learns about the ideas that have come before. Nobody learns about other areas of debate. Nobody learns of this as a contested profession. Settled assumptions of what gets discussed. So economics finally assumes that politics and economics are separate, and therefore we should study these things separately. And as we'll see, we can see by the title, political economy assumes that politics and economics are together and must be studied together, that it's impossible to separate them. That's one of the things that makes them substantially different from each other. So an example of borrowing a concept from the natural sciences can be seen in the concept of equilibrium, which originates in physics. Now, when we apply the concept of equilibrium to the economy, we see that there's some major problems when we borrow terms from the natural sciences, right? So firstly, the assumption here is that we assume the economy works the same way the physical world works, that the economy is a stable thing, and that even if it becomes temporarily unstable, it's going to return to stability by itself. What's wrong with this? Well, this is a huge leap of faith. And Adam Smith and many subsequent economists actually argued that this idea of market equilibrium is something we should believe in because it's proof that markets were actually God's work. So there is a direct link between this idea of faith in markets and faith in religion as being, linked together. Now, there's nothing necessarily wrong with a religious outlook. However, we should not claim that something is a science, like economics is a science, if it is based on faith-based assumptions. Now, economics moved further towards mathematical and quantitative methods when Alfred Marshall introduced and applied this equilibrium concept. Marshall thought we can measure somebody's motivations simply by how much money they're prepared to spend on something. How much do we want something? Well, we can measure it as a dollar value. If somebody's only willing to pay $1 for something, they don't want it very much. Whereas if they're prepared to spend millions of dollars, they must want it really, really much. Okay, this is what we call a subjective theory of value. So Marshall is famously quoted as saying, a person's motives can be approximately measured by the sum of money they will give up in order to secure a desired satisfaction, or again, by the sum which is required to induce him to undergo a certain fatigue. What are we prepared to pay for something? What are we prepared to sacrifice for something? That's the basic way of finding out what value is. So in other words, according to Marshall, things like wages, prices, and profits are all just numbers, and we can analyze these using maths. Now, following Marshall, William Stanley Jevons argued for a name change. Up until this point, there was only political economy. There was no such thing as economics. Jevons was one of the people who wanted to popularize the idea of economics as a science and introduced the idea of economics as a name as a way of differentiating it from political economy and raising it to the level of a science. Why isn't economics a science? Let's go through the reasons. So firstly, economics is mostly not evidence-based. It seems strange because they do all this mathematical proofs and stuff, but actually economics is mostly based on modeling, not actual empirical evidence. So we have some assumptions of the way the world works, and then we test how people's behavior would play out if indeed the world works like that. It's a modeling process. So what's wrong with this? I mean, studying economics involves some conceptual problems. Most of the things that go into economic models don't actually exist. Perfect competition never exists anywhere, but it's in every economic model. Concepts like utility are vague. We're told that we want to maximize our utility. Marshall just told you utility is how much you want something, basically. But there's various definitions of utility. It's a terribly vague concept. Some people define utility as happiness. Some people define utility as preference satisfaction, where you get what you want. Some people define utility as an ideal state of mind. There are endless definitions of what is a vague concept. But economics assumes utility exists, and utility is something we always want to maximize. Finally, we have rational actors, efficient markets, and supply and demand determining price. All of things are assumed not only to be true, but to be always true, that we're always rational, that markets are always efficient, and that supply and demand always determines price. So textbooks on economics contain lots of models and lots of supposedly eternal laws, but little or no evidence to support the laws. Now, a hallmark of science is that when ideas are proven wrong, we're supposed to drop those ideas and move on to ideas that are actually supported by evidence. But we can't do this in economics because economics does not respond to evidence. There's substantial evidence that people are not rational, that we use things like bias or heuristics to make decisions. So we're not making rational decisions most of the time. So there's no evidence to support a relationship between unemployment and unemployment payments, welfare payments. There are regular financial crises where markets completely collapse. And yet we cling to this idea that markets are efficient things. So despite all of the evidence to the contrary, economics sticks to these models and these ideas that the market is a normal functioning thing, that people are rational decision makers, and that therefore we can, the economy is a stable and predictable entity that we can understand through these universal laws. One more hallmark of the scientific method is that we can repeatedly test our hypotheses. Now, this is another reason we can't consider economics as science. In the real world, it's not possible to test repeatedly economic hypotheses. Take, for example, an economic crisis. If we wanted to test which the best economic policy was, we would need to find 3 identical countries with identical history, population, wages, level of development. They're completely identical. And then we need to force one of them to implement, for example, social democracy, one of them to implement a version of Marxism, one of them to implement free market economics as a policy framework. And then we need to measure them and compare them and see what the results are. Now, this, of course, never happens. Firstly, countries are never identical. Secondly, ideologies are never perfectly implemented. And thirdly, we never really agree on their measurement comparisons either. But economists continue to make cross-country comparisons or cross-regional comparisons within a single country, usually for the purpose of arguing that one form of policy is better than another. So economics has very little power to make predictions, and because it can't make predictions, this is another reason we should not treat it as a science. It's missing a key component of things that are, things that rely on the scientific method. So the biggest lie underpinning economics is this idea that its analysis is value-free or value-neutral, that they're just scientists studying the world and they don't care about the outcomes and there's no inbuilt politics into their belief system. This is insane because all of the biggest economic questions that we confront, that human beings have always confronted, are also political questions. How do we deal with a crisis is a political question. How do we deal with unemployment? Should we just force people to work? Should we pay people to work? Should we create more jobs? Whose role is it to create more jobs? Government, business, somebody else? How big should the public sector be? How much involvement should the government have in the economy? How much immigration is good? How much emigration is good? Should we send our people to another country? Questions like what poverty is, how do we define it? Now, is poverty when you don't have a TV? Is poverty when you're starving to death? Is poverty when you can't wear Prada clothes? We don't know. So all of these things involve massive political assumptions. So economists are pretending to be something that they can never be, neutral observers of economic events. I'll argue that everybody has a viewpoint or a bias, a set of ideological assumptions, and economists are no different. The reality is economics is a social science. It will always be a social science. It should stop pretending to be anything other than a social science. And therefore, it's studying human behavior and institutions. It's not studying abstract matter like atoms and chemical compounds. And because we're studying human behavior and human institutions, we need to have a realistic understanding of human behavior and human institutions, that they're fragile, sometimes unpredictable, sometimes erratic. Sometimes people make decisions that are not in line with these economic models. There's a lot going on in the way that we make decisions about the way we spend money, about the way we do politics. And therefore, we cannot reduce our study of the economy to the study of abstract laws. So how does political economy look by contrast? Well, it's an interdisciplinary study. It draws on different areas of knowledge. So it takes things from sociology. Yes, it even takes things from economics. It takes things from political science and history. It takes things from all over the place, right? It studies the way the political environment, political institutions, and the economic system all influence each other. How does politics impact the economic world? How does the economic world determine politics? It studies the interrelationship between government and various social classes and groups in determining resource distribution. An even more basic definition of political economy is it's the study of who gets what and why do they get it. So it studies the economic side of international relations. Sometimes we study what's called international political economy, which is looking at the level of trade between nations and foreign relations policy and how it determines global structures of the economy. and it models certain class processes. So what happens when two or more social classes interact with each other? We're going to look at Smith's theory this week, for example, and Smith's theory includes a bunch of different social classes. So there's the landlords who have the land, there's the industrialists who want to run factories and things, there's the working class who are going to work in the factories, and there's also a servant class who don't do productive labor. So they're just there to serve people's needs, but not actually produce material goods. And all these classes are going to interact with each other, right? Now, Smith has a specific view on what's going to happen when this interaction takes place and who the good guys are and who the bad guys are in this story. You know, and part of the interesting part of political economy is this, you know, working out who the good guys and the bad guys are in these different theories. Why is political economy important? Well, I think it challenges us to think critically about the world and to avoid a simplistic understanding of the world. You know, economics, as I've said, is kind of, it's too complicated when it needs to be simple. You know, it uses maths and statistics when you could find better, simpler explanations for things. And it's too simple when it needs to be complex. Its assumptions about the human world are naive, right? So political economy reminds us that the purpose of the economy is to serve human needs, right? The economy, sometimes we raise it to the level of, you know, it's kind of valuable by itself. You know, that, oh, well, we can sacrifice this many people to boost GDP growth by a couple of percent or something like that, you know? And when we make comments like that, what we're really forgetting is the whole reason we have an economy is to serve human needs. The economy is supposed to serve us. We're not supposed to serve it. So political economy demonstrates the economy is not just about mathematics. It's equally about history, sociology, and many other methods. And that we can use these methods to help understand the economy. So by doing this, by learning political economy, you will significantly improve your analytical skills and your knowledge about lots of different areas. It's going to have a broad impact on the way you think about the world. So what should I look for when I'm studying this course? I'm going to highlight some key components and key questions that you need to think about when we consider each and every theory that we study this semester. The primary question is probably value, and where does it come from? Now, in economics, we've learned so far that value is expressed in the form of price. In other words, it's a subjective theory. Value simply is what we're prepared to pay for something. However, various theories of political economy argue different things about value, and we need to think seriously about why some things are more valuable than others and where value comes from. I've given you an example of this already. The French physiocrats said value comes from the land. So everything that exists that's valuable comes from the land. And if the land is valuable and that's the only source of value, that orients us towards a way of thinking about the world, you know, where we prioritize things like farming and agriculture and stuff like that instead of industry. You know, so we're thinking about value in those terms. Secondly, when we consider each of these theories, we need to think seriously about the policy and political implications of the theory. Theories of political economy always have political consequences. If we agree with the theorist, like if we listen to somebody and think, hey, that guy's got a great idea, what does that mean for the world around us? You know, what would we need to change in order to give the theorist what they want? You know, what does the theorist want the government to do? Theories in the social science are generally not very helpful if they don't make policy suggestions. You know, if a person is just endlessly critiquing something but doesn't offer a solution, they're not telling us very much. So an underlying question we should have is, what does the theorist want us to do? What do they want the government to do? What do they want somebody else to do with the economy? How are we supposed to change it to make it better or something like that? Thirdly, in each of these theories, you'll see that there are some key actors. So who are the most important people or groups in each of these theories of political economy? And what is their role? Are they the good guys? Are they the bad guys? Are they neutral? You know, are they helpful? Are they going to hurt? Are they going to get in the way of future development? Or are they going to be the future development, right? We'll see in each of these theories that there is usually somebody playing a positive role, and there's usually somebody playing a not so positive role. And that's kind of the way a lot of these theories are constructed. So what can I expect during the course? Nobody said political economy is easy. It's going to be challenging, and you're going to be learning about the world in a completely new way, probably. But some clear expectations will help you to succeed. Now on each topic, I'm going to give you a video guide like this where it introduces you to the key points in a theory. Consider that like a study guide that'll help you understand, in summary, what the theory is about. I'll assign some reading each week and you need to complete that. We can definitely discuss the theories and the readings in class, and in fact, that's what you're expected to do. Ideally, you'll complete studying the video guide as well as the reading before we come to class, and then during class we can talk in depth about the material that you've studied, and I can explain things that don't make sense, or we can get into debates about what things mean, about what you agree and disagree with, what you find convincing, what you don't find convincing. In terms of assessment, there's 3 key components. The first is participation. Now, this is assigned a grade of 20%. Now, this is being a liberal arts course. You're expected to contribute a lot during classroom discussion. You're supposed to talk a lot. You're supposed to come prepared. You're supposed to engage with me. You're supposed to debate and discuss things. So a lot of the grade is going to come down to how active you are. And I'm going to record these classes and have some sort of evidence base that sort of to draw on to see how much people are contributing. Again, if you come to class not prepared, if you come to class not having studied, if you come to class not willing to talk and not willing to engage with your classmates or with me, you can expect not to do very well in participation. Secondly, we've got a take-home exam or a research essay. So for those students who feel like they're confident as writers or want to try their best to be somebody who can write a good research essay, you can write one big paper due at the end of semester, and that will be 50% of your grade. If you're not at this stage completely confident about writing one big paper, the option exists to do what's called an essay take-home exam. So this is where you have three or four smaller essays. I haven't decided the exact number yet, but imagine 3 or 4 smaller essays on topics that I'll set for you. And you'll write a short essay about each of them. So probably less intimidating. So if you don't feel so confident writing the final essay just yet, this might be a good option for you. There will also be some short quizzes. From now and then, we'll have some short quizzes which you'll need to complete. This is worth 30% of your overall grade. I'm not going to announce the time where the quizzes are going to happen. Sometimes you'll just show up to class and, hey, lo and behold, you'll be doing a quiz. So, good to keep things unpredictable. At least for me it is. I'm not sure about you. So that's how we're going to do the assessment. Here's my advice on how you can succeed in this course. It's really good to come to class prepared, and ideally you should try and complete the readings before the discussion classes. That's probably not going to be possible this week because it's the first week and we're all adjusting to this new online learning environment. Actively contribute your ideas. Don't just repeat stuff from the PowerPoints. That's really lame. If I want to hear a recording of myself, I'm recording this lecture right now. I can play it back to myself whenever I want. I don't like the sound of my own voice, and I don't want to hear my own words being repeated back to me. All right? I do want to hear what you have to think about this topic. I do want to hear what you understand about the topic. I do want to hear what you disagree about. I'd love to hear you critique some of these theorists and tell me what's wrong with their understanding. Do pay attention to current affairs and how they might relate to the theories we're studying. Now, for example, in India, we're currently in an interesting time where there's a fairly substantial economic crisis taking place. One possible way of thinking through this course is, well, if each of these people who we're going to study this semester was hired as a government advisor, what would they be telling the government to do right now? What would their advice be? If we could resurrect Adam Smith, for example, he's the theorist on this week, and what would he tell the government to do? What does he think they're doing wrong? What does he think the solutions are? Right? Do ask questions during and after the class. And that can be, if you're scared to ask a question over audio, we have Zoom. We have the ability to ask questions using the chat function. If you don't want to ask a question at all during the Zoom meeting, or if you just think of something later that you didn't think of during the class, that's when you can email me. I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to hear your questions via email, and I'd be happy to respond to them. I do prefer that you ask the question in class only so that everybody benefits from the question. But if you think of it later, that's no problem as well. So do contact me if you need help, and do argue your position if you think you're right. Including arguing with me is fine. If you think you're right, don't just back down because I'm an authority figure or something like that. keep arguing your position until you're satisfied. You know, obviously we have limited time in class, so I might shut you down in class, but that doesn't mean I don't want you to keep arguing your position with me later, right? If you think something's correct and you want to defend it and you're defending it logically, keep doing that until you're satisfied. Here's some things don't do, right? So number one, don't plagiarize the essay. You will instantly fail the entire course. There is no way you can get 0 out of 50 for a research essay and yet somehow pass the course at the same time. You know, the essay is worth half your marks. If you cheat on it and I bust you down, you will not recover, you'll fail the course, you'll repeat the course next year because this is a foundation course and you must complete it. Okay, do not come to class and say nothing. And I include in this, like, especially don't come to class and, you know, say nothing and have the video switched off and just passively exist, right? Passivity is generally bad. Don't learn passively and expect me to tell you everything you need to know. A lot of how much you get out of this class is going to be determined by the types of questions that you ask, you know, how engaged you are, how actively you learn, how much you take from the readings, which is the last point. Don't skip the readings. Now, I understand that you're making a transition from high school to university, most of you, and that they're not used to doing a lot of academic reading. So I'm not going to punish you too much, but I'm going to set readings at what I think is an appropriate level. It would be very unwise for you to skip the readings and hope that you can get enough information just based on the study guides or just based on your friend's notes or something else and think that you can do well. You know, do the reading. If you're having problems, ask me some questions, ask your classmates some questions, grapple with it and make sure you understand it. The sooner you start practicing academic reading, the sooner you'll get better at it, the easier it will become. Okay, so I'm leaving my email address here so that you can contact me. And there's also Facebook or other forms of social media you can contact me on. If you're having any problems with the course, please ask your questions early. You know, the sooner you tell me that there's a problem, the sooner I can help you, the less likely you are to fall behind in the class. You know, the more likely you are to catch up and make sure that you're understanding everything at the level that you need to understand. So make sure you contact me as soon as you're having a problem. Here's some references from today's class, you know, Alfred Marshall's book and Smith's book. Anyway, this is the end of the first lecture, which was introducing political economy. I'm looking forward to sharing the rest of the course with you.